Oh, hello there. Yes, turned out damp again. Still, better than being 45 degrees, I suppose. Anyway, today, apart from a ludicrous interview with Jordan Peterson in today's Telegraph, who seemed to believe that magically he's still somebody, other than someone with very serious mental health issues. Anyway, leaving that aside, I thought today we'd once again have a closer look at the right-wingersphere, think tankosphere. I'm going to have to come up with a name for that, aren't I? Anyway, let's have a look at Michael J. Walker from Novara Media interacting with Jacob Rees-Mogg and your friend and yours, Rafe. Yeah, let's dive. Right, yes, well, we start off with Jacob Rees-Mogg, who gives us an outline of the goings-on at the High Court in and around the government's Rwanda policy. And let's meet the panel.
Joining me on this is my panel of contributing editor to Novara Media, Michael Walker, and the historian and senior fellow at the New Culture Forum, Rafe Hadel-Manku. Thank you both very much for joining me. Michael, I mean, it is quite...
Right, yes, indeed. Now, what we're going to see here, this is the, even though it's the classic setup, this is the kind of Fox News setup, whereby we have a supposedly impartial lead journalist interviewer. In this case, this is Rees-Mogg. He's there to have a reasoned debate between two parties. But that's never really the way that Fox News or GBNews actually work. What you've got is two people with identical right-wing opinions, and the other person is there to provide balance. In GBNews' case, this is kind of useful for them vis-a-vis Ofsted. They can say, oh, look, we're giving these different views. But leaving that aside, what I want to highlight here is the way that Michael Walker, who's a very, very good media player these days, handles what is quite a hostile environment. So, let's carry on.
Quite a complicating setup that you appeal to the Court of Appeal to appeal against its own judgment. But the government does have a democratic mandate to begin the Rwanda removals. Surely they should be allowed to get on with them.
Yes, I mean, so it goes from the High Court to the Court of Appeal and then to the Supreme Court. So presumably this will be the final decision, I would imagine. I suppose in terms of the democratic point, the government is, or the Parliament is sovereign, I suppose, but the courts are there to make sure that all of the laws we've signed up to are consistent. Now, Parliament has decided that we will be part of the European Convention on Human Rights. They could decide to leave it. That would put us in the same group only as Greece, who left it after they suspended democracy in the 1960s, and there was a military junta, and Russia after it entered Ukraine. So it's not necessarily company we want to be keeping, but if MPs wanted to, they could leave it, and then obviously the court would say, fine, go ahead, because that's what they think the Rwanda policy is breaching. Now, potentially the Supreme Court will decide that actually Rwanda is a safe enough country. Obviously, the High Court made one decision, it was overturned by the Court of Appeal. So potentially there's differing views within the judiciary. So it could be overturned, but either way, it doesn't seem to me to really impinge on democracy in this country.
And Rafe, the Supreme Court does seem to have moved away from the highest point of judicial activism under...
Right, okay, and just before we get Rafe being set up there, there you have it, Michael Walker coming across as a very, very reasonable human being, which is obviously the typical sort of communist trick that they're going to pull. You'll notice there that Jacob immediately talks about an activist judges, okay, because that's effectively what we're talking about here. The subtext of all of this isn't let's discuss what has gone on. It is surely this is awful. So let's see what Rafe has to say, shall we?
Baroness Hale, when she got herself involved in things which were clearly the responsibility of the executive.
Yes, but this really does play to the government's hands here, because they can then portray themselves as fighting for the rights of the people, being thwarted by the House of Lords and by the judiciary. I'm trying to get excited about this being allowed, but at the end of the day, I view this as a great distraction. You know, the Rwanda policy is simply designed just before an election comes around to convince the British public that the government is actually getting serious, finally. They've had 13 years to get serious. The Rwanda plan is akin to trying to empty a swimming pool with with a teaspoon. There's a whole raft of policies that could easily have been enacted by this government. Denmark has done it successfully. Germany has now got temporary visas for asylum seekers so that they know that they won't be staying in Denmark. They've more than reduced by 3 times the number of asylum seekers there, simply by reducing benefits by 50%, by confiscating assets over £1,000. The only thing you have to do, really, is make Britain less attractive than France. And the government has had 13 years to do this. Crack down on the black markets.
England's always more attractive than France.
Right, okay, and there you have the talking points which Rafe has managed to get in. The teaspoon in the swimming pool one appears to be something we're going to hear quite a lot of. Yesterday, I think, or the day before, I put up a video about him talking about we must reduce benefits by 50%. It's going to be very hard to do in the UK because people get nothing, but that doesn't really matter in what he's going to say. He is there simply to come out with a known line, and if for GBNews' viewpoint, he's a safe pair of hands. So let's move on.
Reasons. But in terms of your point, that yes, of course, the government could withdraw from the European Convention, but on the prisoner voting rights, it eventually had a negotiation with the Council of Europe so that both sides accepted some element of compromise, that we could do effectively what we wanted, but we accepted that the court had some authority. Do you think there's something along those lines that can be done so that this policy can be implemented in a way that leaves everybody happy?
I mean, I suppose that's possible. That'll be up to the government to have a negotiation with an international body. I suppose to push back slightly on where you're coming from there, I do think there is this misleading notion which is often put out, which is to say that the UK is a real soft touch on migrants and we're incredibly attractive and everyone wants to come here. Now, I think what that avoids is actually that there's almost double the number of asylum applications in France as there are here. So the issue for me is if you want to get tough on illegal migration, you have to be willing to take your fair share of asylum seekers in the first place. And at the moment, actually, we take relatively very few asylum seekers compared to other European countries. So I do think there's potentially a bit of a misleading image which being put forward.
If those asylum seekers are legitimate.
We must move on.
Yes, and at that point, the video from the New Culture Forum jumps on to the next segment. But again, the horrific communist there was being very, very reasonable. I think you'll agree. Anyway, let's again jump on.
Now, it seems our cultural institutions are dominated by the self-flagellating wokerati. But the question is, where does it take us? Well, a major charitable foundation might just have found the answer. Self-cancelization. Langley Chase, an independent charity which provides millions in grants, I think it has £130 million in its assets, for all things social, racial and climate justice, has just announced its decision to abolish itself after concluding that philanthropy is a function of colonial capitalism. Perhaps The Guardian could enter this moral maze too and decide that its slave trade links leave it no choice but to shut up shop. But whilst on the face of it this is a rather amusing, silly story, it poses the bigger question about our unelected institutions and how the left has such a stranglehold on them. Very importantly, it was recently announced that the Office for Budget Responsibility latest appointment, Rita de la Feria, is a Brexit-hating, Corbyn-supporting lefty, and she should fit right in. Now, with me is my panel, contributing editor to Novara Media, Michael Walker, and fellow of the New Culture Forum, Rafe Hadelman-Koo.
Right, okay, and yes, once again, you can see the setup here, okay? This is the framing that we have, and, you know, whenever people talk about left-wing media in this country, this is effectively the framing that you get across the board in the media. Lots of people, and later on we'll sort of talk about how left-wing the BBC is, for example, but this is what you get. What Jacob has done here, he's basically said, this is ridiculous, isn't it? And it's also dangerous. How much do you agree with me? Effectively, this is what they're talking about here. And of course, this plays very much to Rafe's home territory.
Rafe, you haven't been taken control of by the left-wing wokerati. How did you avoid this?
Well, look, I mean, the thing is, the left understand the importance of institutional capture far better than the right, and they're far more skilled at getting it. You know, Rudi Dushko, the Marxist activist, called this the long march through the institutions, and it really has taken place, you know. I don't think people
Right, okay, and yes, okay, so Jacob bowls him that very easy ball, and he bats back with the expected stroke, which is, yes, it's all the fault of the cultural Marxists that magically were persecuted by the Nazis and then later on persecuted by the CIA in America, but we won't ever tell you that. And it's Adorno, Horkheimer, and the rest of them. It's all their fault. That's basically where he's coming from. So he's peddling the same stuff that New Culture Forum and a wide variety of the Tufton Street crew do so. Cultural Bolshevism, that old Nazi trope. And again, they won't actually mention that themselves. Let's move on.
Are quite aware that we've had in Britain, actually, a quiet revolution has taken place. A revolution doesn't mean uprisings and red flags flying from the rooftops. The buildings that house our institutions may look the same, but the people who run those institutions and inhabit them are cuckoos in the nest, who bear no relationship to the people who built those institutions and who ran them until very recently. This all started in the 1990s, particularly under New Labour, and of course it's carried on, unfortunately, under the Conservatives. And I'm terribly sorry to say that again, but along with immigration, the woke takeover of our institutions has been the biggest single damage to our country over the last 20 years.
Yes. Anyway, there you go. That's what you get, folks. That's the end of the video. And luckily, Michael said, "Oh, well, that's fair enough," and got off the sofa and walked home. Well, maybe not. After a little bit of digging, actually, because it was quite hard to find. I've got the rest of the conversation, which I think is a lot more instructive. So let's go there now.
Michael, I'm not actually particularly fussed about Langley Chase.
Yes, indeed. Okay. Yes, and magically there is more. Yes. Let's move on.
As long as it's within the foundational documents of the charity. If a charity wants to wind itself up, that's fine. If its reason is absurd, that's a matter for it. But Rita de la Feria is quite serious, isn't it? Because the ABR has enormous unelected power. It can, as we saw last year, it can make or break a government. And therefore, having a Corbynista going on to a body that's already been in conflict with the government is quite a problem.
I'm not sure she's a Corbynista. I also don't shed many tears for right-wingers feeling sorry for themselves because it's so difficult to get into the institutions. Because, I mean, GBNews is an example, right? Novara Media, my organisation, we're paid for by our viewers, right? It's had to grow very, very slowly. GBNews, someone has an idea, let's make a right-wing channel.
Decolonisation of our museums and our galleries, our universities.
Suddenly, you get venture capital that buys you a lovely studio.
The BBC, a left-wing organisation.
I don't think the BBC is a left-wing organisation. Anyway,
whenever they have a Conservative chairman, he gets...
Right, okay, and yeah, this is where it gets a lot more interesting, because what Michael does is he punches through the third wall, journalistically speaking, whereby he starts talking about the representation that's going on here. You'll notice that Rafe isn't very much of a happy punter at the moment, but just that instantaneous non-talking point. Oh, well, the BBC's left-wing, and this person's left-wing, and therefore they shouldn't be allowed. This is where you get to see the authoritarian nature of the stuff that we're looking at, yeah? These people shouldn't be allowed. You're not allowed to have opinions if you're in high office, and by opinions they mean anything that's vaguely left-wing, in which case you will be called a Corbynista. And don't forget, one way or another, whether you like it or not, that Jeremy Corbyn, if he was in wider European politics, would merely be regarded as a social democrat, because that's effectively where he comes from. Yes, it's of the left, but it's an enormously long way short of communism. But, of course, it is still, in this country, way too threatening to the establishment. And these two people, Jacob and Rafe, will present themselves in some way as anti-establishment, despite the fact that they are absolutely the epitome of the establishment.
Let's bring these points together, and I think the BBC and the OBR are somewhat similar. Now, I think these institutions actually tend towards small c conservatism, Now, what I mean by that is not necessarily ideological conservatism, but they tend towards supporting the status quo. Now, you absolutely saw this with the BBC when it came to Jeremy Corbyn. Any kind of dispute in the Labour Party, if an MP was about to be deselected, they'd call it Stalinism. Now MPs are getting deselected left, right and centre, and there isn't a peep. When it comes to the OBR, lots of wonks were against Brexit. I know this person was against Brexit. That's because technocrats tended to agree that it wouldn't make Britain richer. The OBR, though, I think we might have an agreement, because I would get rid of it. I think it was introduced by George Osborne. The whole point of the OBR is to make government decision-making just about accounting, and what we have had since 2010, when George Osborne introduced it, is flatlining wages, flatlining productivity. And I actually don't think balancing budgets is the most important function of the Treasury. I think what they should be doing is investing in the future, taking more of a Joe Biden approach, right? American growth has been much higher than UK growth over the past decade. And one thing they have had is a more activist government,
and Donald Trump's tax cuts, actually, which were crucially important in his reform of corporation tax and his big reductions in it, had an amazing effect on the US economy, which the ABR would simply stop in this country.
Well, in both directions, right?
Yeah,
so they
yeah.
would have stopped those tax cuts, but they also would have stopped Joe Biden's very, very ambitious subsidies and spending on the green economy. So, yeah, maybe we do agree on that.
Well, the idea that our institutions are small c conservative, I don't think you'll find a single viewer who would be agreeing with that. We're talking about culture.
Right, OK, and again, you can notice that Michael is very much on top of his brief. He's not fazed by the minutiae of recent political history or anything. But Rafe really is desperately uncomfortable with the notion of different points of view. And again, you get this thing about all of these libertarian free speeches, about how much it's so important to be given a different point of view. And the first reaction that Rafe has to this isn't to question what the guy has said, but simply to say, oh, the viewers won't agree with you. Yeah, well, they're GBNews viewers, mate, so they don't get a different point of view, or if they do, it's in tiny slithers like this. It's not an argument, yeah? The majority of the people in the world are religious. It's not an argument that therefore gods exist. You can't make those sorts of claims, okay? Yeah?
Here, and it's the culture of our institutions that
Well, here we're talking
changed
about economics.
fundamentally, but it's that same culture which is leading to people appointing people who have left-wing economic views. The entire culture has set into place now. For example, when I was at university, you would have two left-wing academics for every one conservative academics. Now it's closer to 11 to 1, and it's even worse in America. In primary and secondary schools now, we have fewer than 10% of teachers now vote for centre-right parties. You know, you just look at decolonisation. Through the British Museum, our institutions have been taken over at every level, and it's a far more insidious thing than we think, because all institutions should have a balance to be healthy. Extreme right or extreme left is wrong, and when you're being told about the evils of being white in school, we're now being taught that the Church of England is teaching about the white supremacy pyramid. That is a left-wing takeover of our institutions.
Tony Blair was very clever, is that he reformed the institutions and then set up appointment processes that are much more likely to attract left-wing applicants than right-wing applicants. And that has led to people going into quangocracy as a career in a way that wasn't happening previously, because essentially the great and the good were asked to take over the chairmanship of the British Museum. They were tapped on the shoulder and that was it, which may or may not be a good way of doing things, but now the application process favours people who've had a career as quangocrats.
So I think there's...
Right, just before Michael sort of gets into that, there's a level of irony here, which of course Mr. Bowtie and Mr. Lord failed to see. They are bitterly complaining about people who are a bit useless, being establishment figures and just going through life with no real sense of the real world. Whereas Michael is somebody who is completely opposite to that. He's a guy who, I know for a fact, if you watch Novara Media, you know this as well. He's a guy who has to rent. He lives in the real world in a way that these two people don't. And you'll notice that Rafe again just comes out with the standard stuff that you hear. Oh, you know, the communists are indoctrinating our children, and therefore all of these made up stories about what's going on in schools is proof that they're taking over. We've had 13 years, as Rafe says, rightly so, of this government, and to bitterly complain, or indeed to magic them up as a centre-right party, is I am beyond gobsmacked when these people do these kind of things. Anyway, let's move on.
There's two things going on here. Now, one, there are certain professions where people tend to be more liberal and more left-wing. I think that's partly because the working age population is actually more liberal and more left-wing. The Tory vote is reliant essentially on pensioners, right? And there's only so many pensioners you can insert into great cultural institutions because they're not currently of working age. I also think that when it comes to sort of the right's obsession with quangos and the like, now, as I've said, I don't think the OBR has performed very effectively. But I do think it comes partly as a distraction from the other spheres of cultural life where what gets you influence is money. So look at the Murdoch press, for example. Look at the newspapers. Now, all of them are right-leaning, nearly all of them are right-leaning, and that's because what gets you influence when it comes to newspapers is money. What do rich people want? They want low taxes. So there's a huge sphere of our cultural life where it's dominated by the right, and that's because money talks.
The Guardian, the Mirror, and the Financial Times all lean leftwards.
Centre-left, right? So how did they all treat Jeremy Corbyn? How did they all treat an anti-establishment left-wing politics? And also, I mean, the circulation of the other papers dwarfs those three.
But far more important is education. You know, the old adage was, from Aristotle, give me a boy till the age of 7 and I will show you the man. It's now...
Right, okay, and again, you know, people like myself would absolutely been saying the same thing. We have a media landscape that is dominated by non-dom billionaires. Just on any basis, people like Murdoch own 87, close enough to 90% of the British media is owned by non-dom institutions or single individual billionaires. And you can't get away from it. You can't squirm out of it. So, of course, Rafe simply goes back to the dangers of communist teachers.
Very much give me a boy till the age of 18 or 21, and I'll show you somebody who's gone now through every stage of education with a predominantly left-wing teaching agenda.
Well, thank you very much to my brilliant panel. Amazing level of agreement coming out this evening. Coming up, are we approaching a Cold War with China?
Right, okay, and just to finish there, yes, there is a very, very good chance that young people going through schools will have had a left-wing teacher. But I'm 60, and the majority of my teachers were left-wing as well. Is that the reason I'm left-wing? No. I'm left-wing predominantly because I think, at least in part, it's genetic, but also because I'm educated. I'm likely to be left-wing because I'm educated. As the old saying goes, reality is left-wing. Yes, so there you are. The bits the free speech merchants didn't want you to see. Yes, and you just on any rational basis, who comes across best there? Who comes across as calm, rational, knowledgeable? Yeah, it's not the guy in the bow tie, unfortunately, is it? Senior fellow? There are ordinary fellows at the New Culture Forum. I don't think there are. I think everybody's a senior fellow, aren't they? Because they only employ senior fellows. Yes, anyway, yeah, just a really, really nice way that you can see the way the system works, okay? You're allowed to be left-wing, but not for long, maybe. Have a nice day.